everyone.
Good evening.
It was a trek to get the ice and stuff, but we got it. So anyway, we're ready to go. So here's this one's fun. Not really like the other one, not like the last presentation, because this one is really much more about exactly what this says. But just to review quickly from last week, we ran into an interesting problem. The universe is not sitting still. It's expanding. And that creates all kinds of interesting problems that we discussed last week. And we left it with this, is that a lot of people are now, some people, are trying to dodge that. How do we get around some of the things we talked about by just saying there's an infinite number of universes? That in itself is an admission that your data is not supporting just simply explaining this earth. So this is a foundational argument. None of them are intended to be like absolute knockouts, but what they do is they build on each other, and then when you get through with it, it's like, okay, well, what are the options here? So, is the Bible reliable? Can we trust it? Now, this is a guy, his name is Richard Dawkins. Some of you probably heard of him. He is a big-time atheist who's made a bunch of money, and he made a bunch of money on this book. It was called The God Delusion. It came out in about 2005, 2006. This is what he says in it, if you can't read that. It's not that the Bible's evil, it's just weird. And that's exactly what you would expect of a chaotically cobbled together anthology of disjointed documents composed, revised, translated, distorted, and improved by hundreds of anonymous authors, editors, and copyists, unknown to us and mostly unknown to each other, spanning 9 centuries. This represents the dissenting view in about 60 words very well. This is what the average skeptic thinks, that Scripture is just that. A bunch of stuff made up by a bunch of people. Nobody knows whether any of it's true or not. So the question is, adjust that just a tad. Or just tighten it up a little bit and make it come on. There you go. The question is, why do we believe that the Bible is authentic? Josh McDowell is a very famous speaker, publisher, author. He says he's asked that question to over 4,000 people, pastors, churchgoers. Okay. He said he's had about 10 people give him a decent answer. Well, that means, if he's right, that the average person sitting in the pews today can't tell you why they believe the Bible is accurate. Now, of course, if you can't do that, then you can't really speak to the skeptic out there who's asking these questions. So, with that in mind, tonight, you will be part of the 10 plus that can actually speak to this. So, why do we think it is what it is? And this is not an answer. To tell a skeptic, well, it's the inspired word of God. And the skeptic's going to look at you and go, that's not an answer. And the skeptic has every right to say that, because you're not using data, you're just using your own preferences. So, why do we believe it? Well, here's a pretty good reason. So, get my little mouse here, get on the little
Let's have a moment of honesty here. Everything we believe hangs on this book being true. A book that's been copied by hand in a game of telephone lasting centuries. Yeah, let's deal with that down further. To trust this book, you have to trust the people that made it. So, let's look at the work of a scribe responsible for the Torah. Before he can ever touch into paper, there are 4,000 rules he has to memorize. He's a professional responsible for every stage of production. Preparing the calfskin, creating a grid with pinholes and string, so each letter is in the same place. Each word reads with the same ease and accuracy as the original. Even the tedious task of preparing a day's worth of ink from gallnuts. He copies one word at a time, first saying, then writing, then saying it again. make a mistake on God's name, he starts the whole document over. Every single letter, 304,805 of them, is written according to a prescribed set of strokes. He writes with a feather quill by candle with ink that bleeds and runs. The letters must not touch. We're talking about a lifetime of backbreaking dedication. And that means this book is not just any book. It means that the words it contains, God meeting his people face to face, God leading, protecting, providing for them, those words can't be a mistake. So we're forced to deal not just with words, but with the living God himself.
These scribes were so committed because they were committed to 5 areas of accuracy. 1, they needed to make sure they copied it correctly. 2nd, they read it correctly. And just as important, they interpreted it correctly. And just as important, they pronounced it correctly. And 5th, they treated it with great sacredness. All of these precautions are built within this text. The only piece of literature in all the history like this, built within this text are 4,000 regulations to guarantee accuracy. 4,000. No one ever did that before within a text. For example, they believed if they created that perfect grid with a line started exactly in the same place, ending in the same place, straight line, it'd be easier to read it, easier to interpret it, and more correctly to copy it. And it's true. That's why if you come up here, now don't you do this for this, you look carefully, you find a little line of pinholes right down through there. Pinholes. Now why? If you could undo the muscles from a calf skin that hold the sheets together, you would and unfold it where they would tighten it, you can see the pinholes on every one. Why? What they did, they took and put pins in exact grid all the way down. Then they took strings and they traced it from one to the other, and then they would take like a sharp piece of bone or glass and they would score the text. You can see in the margins, perfect scoring with candlelight. It probably took several months to do it. Perfect scoring. Why? Because they believed that they had that perfect grid. And look at the one here. Turn the grid up there. You see, well, that's upside down. People come up here and say, well, Josh, Pastor, take this. I said, you know, you wrote it upside down. I said, well, no. That's Gentile ignorance. Jewish wisdom is different than ours. You see, if we did a grid, we would write the letters on top of the line. And the J and the G would go below the line. They didn't do that. They hung the letters from the line, so certain letters went above the line. So when you walk up to this, it looks upside down when it's right side up. Now, here's the problem. They wanted everything to start with the exact same margin. You can see the scoring on the text there, and end with the exact margin. Now, here's the problem. You don't hyphenate Hebrew. So what do you do if the word is too long? What they would often do is compress the letters in to end exactly on the line. But here's the problem. They cannot touch. This was done with candlelight. You can see wax droppings on it with a quill from a goose that bleeds everything. And if any 2 letters touched, they had to erase it and correct it within 30 days, because the Bible says, let no evil dwell within your tent. But if any 2 letters in the name of God touched, it takes up to 3 years to copy one of these. The last month, your pen bleeds or whatever, and 2 letters touch, they can't correct it, can't use the text. After 3 years of work. And they can erase these, but see there, they cannot touch, and done with a quill. And then, they would often do this. They would take the last letter of the word before the end, and they would stretch it out to the margin called elongated. See right there? They would stretch that out so you had a perfect margin. Now, go to the next slide. You can see these all down there, the next one. Every scribe had to have memorized by heart the entire Torah. By heart. But they could never copy 1 letter by heart from memory. You say, what? Yeah. This is what they'd have to do. So they'd start out there, the first letter, or scribe. They'd first pronounce the word scribe, and then they had to do it. See, you look at that scribe, you memorize it, scribe. They couldn't do it. They'd look at it, pronounce it, scribe, S, S, C, C, R, R. And then when they finished, they had to pronounce it again. Why? To help guarantee accuracy of copy. And then, every single letter, 304,805, has to be done to an exact formula by strokes. Look at this one here. Every single time that letter is used, it has to be done exactly the same way. 304,805 letters. Sometimes 8-10 minutes to do one letter with a quill. Now these are some of the letters. You can take magnifying glasses, look at that. Every one of those letters is a work of art. Done with a feather from a goose usually. Go, keep going now, just go right through them. Look at these, they're beautiful. You can see them right there. You swear it has to be printed. There is no way anyone could copy this, let alone so long ago with a quill or a reed pen with candlelight. Every letter has to be done exactly the same way with the same strokes, everything. Now, in Matthew 5:18, now, when they did finish this, their goal, now you have to stick this in your craw because at the end, it'll help you to make sense of the story I share, the illustration why it's accurate. Every single letter had to be so clear, written so exact, that could be, their guide was, it could be understood by a school child. Now stick that in your craw. That's very important in trusting the scriptures. And then in Matthew 5:8.
Okay, so I'm going to copy an earlier copy. First thing I got to do is prepare my entire myself, my entire scroll. Every piece has to be animal skins, has to be dried, has to be stretched, then they have to be stitched together. My scroll is going to be the same length as that scroll because when we don't have time in here, but there is in some of these, like they will go to the middle letter, and if it's not of the whole book, if it's not where the middle letter is supposed to be, you can't use the scroll. So these guys would then take these pinholes that they would use in order to create the lines that they use with the string so they can hang the letters from the top. So their letters are hanging down instead of sitting. And their margins are now perfect to where each one of these is a, what we call it on the computer, justified? Yeah, margins are justified on the left and the right. And so my scroll, when I copy it, looks exactly like the scroll that I copied. And they did this, and they did this, and they did this. So when we find, and we're not going to talk too much about the Old Testament, but that's how the Old Testament was done. So when they get to the Dead Sea Scrolls and they pull some of that stuff out, and they found some of these that go way further back than what they had previously had for manuscripts, and they look at them and it's like it's still exactly the same. So we can have high confidence that these guys doing this stuff were copying exactly what they saw, exactly the way it had to be done. And it's just like he was saying, you can't just copy alias. If you're going to copy, if the word that they were copying was alias, they'd say the word alias, and they'd say the word back, alias, A, L, L, so forth and so on, A, S, S. Probably took an hour to print that, alias. Now we go to the next word. And every word was done like this. That scroll that he had rolled out there is about 600 years old. He got it from a church in Poland. He actually bought it. He brings us around to churches all around the country. And it's one of the few scrolls that's really absolutely totally intact the way it is. So it's a magnificent piece of historical artifact. But what it teaches us is these guys weren't just sitting in a room just writing down stuff in a hurry. They were treating this information with the utmost reverence. I'm not sure that you could take a printer today and print the thing off because by the time the ink started running out of the cartridge, you probably have as many mistakes as they had. If they made a mistake, they would have to note it, that they had added something in. They could still use it, but they had to correct it. And then it's like you said, if you screwed up on God's name, it didn't matter where you were. The whole thing got thrown away. So when they got to Yahweh, you can imagine at this point everybody's taking a deep breath, because it's like, let's make sure we get this right. But you could have spent 3 years or more on this, and it's got to go out the door. So that's how the replication by hand was done for the Old Testament.
Let's have a moment of honesty here.
So what about the New Testament? Well, here's what we have again. This is a New Testament scholar. His name is Daniel Wallace. Really low.
That's the max we're going to get. It is on 100%.
Yeah, I don't think you can hear it. So I'm going to just go ahead and tell you what he's doing. He's going to tell you that when we first got the King James manuscript, how many manuscripts were they working off of? 6. King James was written off of 6 manuscripts. The NIV is written off of about 6,000. 5,800. We're talking Greek here. We're talking the original Greek, not the translations over to Latin and all that. We've got, if you take those, we've got like 25,000. So 6,000 manuscripts in the original Greek now have been discovered since the time that they wrote the King James. So when somebody says it's the King James or nothing, they don't know what they don't understand what they're saying. But we have our well of information is much deeper now. That said, how much has changed from the NIV to the King James Version? Nothing of any consequence. Nothing. About worst case scenario, 1%. Best case scenario, about 0.5%. So the New Testament documents that we have, and we're about to see, well, how old were they? We'll get to that. But what we're about to see is that the New Testament documents, obviously much more recent, we know very, very well how we got those. This guy's name is Daniel Wallace. He's a New Testament scholar. In his world, he would be like a Joe Montana. He would be he would be the person, if you said his name in his world, everybody's going to go, yeah, we know who that guy is. So he's an eminent researcher, so I apologize for that. So, this is what we have now. If you look at that, the New Testament, as we said, we've got almost 6,000 in the original Greek. If you want to talk about Homer, his Iliad, he's got about 650. If you want to talk about Plato, about 49. And if you want to talk about Aristotle, we have less than 10. So we've got this huge number of original languages. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Aristotle was approximately 1,500 years the first copy that we have. Plato was about 1,200. Homer was, I think, about 500 or 600, somewhere around in there. Check this out. If anybody starts telling you different, you're going to see why. The New Testament manuscripts are within 50 years of when they were originally written. The originals are called the autographs. And the copies that we have, the earliest copies, are approximately 50 years after the autographs. And somebody would say, whoa, they could have written all kinds of stuff in there in the meantime. Well, this is what we have. Every time you find a younger, and that's been done 127 of them in the last 116 years. By younger means getting closer to the autographs. So they're more original, if you will. So they've found 127 in the last 116. The Daniel Wallace, that's the guy you just saw, not a single new reading has commended itself as authentic. In other words, when you get the older one and you superimpose it on the younger one, they look the same. The copying was done with high fidelity. Does that make sense? And every time they've done this, it doesn't matter. Every time they find one younger, they can compare it to the older. And guess what? When they find the younger, it looks exactly like the older, which tells you that they did what? They copied these things very well. The papyri function to confirm what we already thought was the original wording, or in some cases to confirm an alternate reading, but one that's already in the manuscripts. You look in your Bible sometimes and it'll say, some manuscripts say. And that's where and when you read it and you look at it and you go, well, it could say this or it could say that, and at the end of the day, neither one of them is a game breaker. So that you'll see that all the time. When you see that, that's because somewhere since the King James, somebody found some manuscripts. They've been discovered. Wasn't that long ago in Egypt, they found these masks that they were using for mummies. Guess what they were making the paper from? The Gospel of Mark. Yeah. Because they didn't, for them,
Just paper.
Just paper. We don't need that. Yeah. So this was an excellent source of historic. And then some people started arguing, oh no, we can't tear the mask up because the mask is historical. Well, I think sometimes what's happening there is somebody's going, we really don't want, because this is gonna wreck our case, right? But here's the deal. So autographs. These are the originals. When it says Mark, that would be the autograph of Mark, right? And so as we find these things, if we find a piece, and when we say a manuscript, it may only be a piece about this big. So then they have to overlay it, right? They don't find the whole thing. Most of the time it's a fragment. But when they overlay the fragment on the fragment that they already have, the fragment is the same. They just don't find any differences. So that's important, but it gets better. There's a guy named Bart Ehrman, and this is lights on, so I'll kind of read this one for you. How many heard of Bart Ehrman? See, Bart Ehrman has done more to kick the can of Christianity on the curb than a lot of people. He's made a lot of money. He used to be, he called himself a believer. And then he wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. That sounds very much like what Dawkins said, didn't it? Now, we can't trust this stuff. We don't know where it came from. And his premise of the book, you can still find it in print anywhere, is that the New Testament manuscripts are so unreliable that we don't really know what Jesus taught, and his resurrection cannot be trusted. Miracles are not a possibility. Sold a lot of copies, and a lot of people bought this because Bart Ehrman said it, and Bart Ehrman he's a University of North Carolina. He like Daniel Wallace in that field. If you say Bart Ehrman, you just said Mickey Mantle. These are people that are widely known, widely respected. But he stepped into a little bit of a thunderstorm, a cluster here. Because his whole notion is, this is no good. So he sold a bunch of these books. And then in his paperback version, he hit this. This was about, I think this was like the 3rd or 4th edition. So he's out in paper, because the first thing you sell them is the hardbacks, because you can make a lot of money on the hardbacks. And then so you get into this. Well, this appears in his paperback edition, the later edition. Bruce Metzger. Bruce Metzger would be Henry Aaron. So he's better than Mickey Mantle. So what Bart Ehrman is saying right now is Metzger was the guy that taught me. So he says, he's one of the great scholars of modern time, by the way, dedicated Christian. I dedicated the book to him because he was my inspiration for going into textual criticism and the person who trained me in the field. I have nothing but respect and admiration. Even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he's a firmly committed Christian and I am not. We're in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. If he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen out of many thousands. The position I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. Somebody put that in plain language for me.
They're saying the same thing.
I just got called. I got called out. What did he just basically say? There is no difference between what Metzger thinks and what I think. But yet he wrote an entire book that says what? You can't believe any of this stuff. And then he concludes in his afterword of his book, the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants. Do you think the resurrection is an essential part of the Christian faith? The words, teachings of Jesus are not really knowable, and his resurrection cannot be trusted. The position I argue for does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position. Whoa! Didn't come out until the paperback. Yet I think any person can reasonably ask, why did you just admit that the book you wrote is not accurate? And I suspect he got a phone call that said, you got two ways you can do this. You can own up to it, or you're about to get completely blasted in the academic side of things. He made his money, I guess, but anybody that reads Misquoting Jesus, if you don't get the right book, you don't get the whole story. So, what have we got so far? Well, we've got the people who tried to take a shot at it. Dawkins says it's all cobbled together, but indeed it's not cobbled together. It's been fastidiously copied and copied and copied in the Old Testament. When we get to the New Testament, we've got 6,000 Greek manuscripts. And when they take the pieces and overlay them and stick them on the one that's earlier, they look the same. And that's what he's saying. So what Ehrman says in his book is, somebody may have spelled eight, E-I-G-H-T-T. Right? He said, well, that's a variant, and therefore we can't know what the person was trying to spell. If you read E-I-G-H-T-T, what would you know? Eight. Somebody stuck something in there, but we know what they were trying. So that was his position in the book, but then when he gets called on it, he goes, no. And that's just amazing. Misquoting Jesus, and there's nothing at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants. That's Paul telling Peter. I mean, that's just straight up, you got caught. I don't know any other way to say it. So, but you'll hear this all the time. It's been copied and recopied, and we can't tell. We don't know who wrote anything anymore. Well, the guy who knows says, yeah, we do. All right, so we got one other option. We know it's accurate, but maybe it's just accurately wrong. Maybe they started off with them accurately wrong. We just took the bad rumor and ran with it instead of making sure that we had the information that we were supposed to have. Now, this guy's name is Craig Evans. I think you'll be able to hear him because he's loud. Craig Evans would be Willie Mays. So all of these guys in their worlds are absolute. If you say their names in those academic circles, everybody dares to know who you're talking about.
With Dr. Craig Evans, and he talked a little bit about the manuscript evidence, and then he just tell us how many ancient Greek manuscripts there are and evidence of the New Testament.
Happy to do so. There are 5,800 manuscripts that we know of in Greek that were produced prior to the invention of the printing press. About 200 of these date to the year 300 AD or earlier. A few of them actually reach back into the 2nd century. In other words, within about 50 years or so of when the Greek New Testament writings were originally produced, when they were produced in the 1st century. And what we find is that these manuscripts are not only numerous and very early, they're also very accurate. We're able to compare them and through study come within 99.6 or so %, we feel confidently of what the original text read when the apostles wrote the writings in the 1st century. We also have discovered that the manuscripts were in use a very long time before they were discarded.
This is important.
We know this because of manuscript discoveries in Egypt, especially at the city of Oxyrhynchus. We see that manuscripts were used for typically 150, 200, even 300 years or longer before being discarded. Now, if this holds and applies to the New Testament writings, this means that the original writings, what we call the autographs, would have been in circulation at least 100 years or longer, which means then that the writings we now have that have survived, that we have in museums and libraries today, that these writings that we possess would have been written around the year 200 to 220 AD, at a time when the originals were still in circulation and were still available for copying and for study and for comparison. This strongly encourages us to believe that indeed the manuscripts do preserve the original text faithfully, and we should have every confidence that the Greek New Testament that we now possess, on which is based, of course, modern translations, English, German, whatever, that the text is faithful and accurate. And there is no room for this, or cause for this extreme skepticism that we've heard in recent years about there being so many mistakes in the manuscripts that we really don't know how the text originally read. That just flies in the face of the actual evidence.
Trivia question. What was the picture behind Washington in Valley Forge?
Oh yeah, he's kneeling.
So, what did he just say?
Here's the copies.
So this is the deal. The first autographs are written by the originals, and then they're distributed somewhere. You just don't write them and go, "Hey, let's go put them in the closet, right? And cover them." No, you're sending this out. The churches were spreading. So I've got the autograph from Mark. I'm Mark, and I hand my copy off. Now, if Mark wrote one, what is that? Do you think Mark just said, "Oh, bring back my copy"? There's a very good chance Mark did what? He's got enough. Exactly. So you're in this little church, and all of a sudden somebody knocks on the door, UPS, brown truck pulls up, and you got to sign for it, and you sign for Mark. So now you've got Mark. What do you do with it? Copy it. Because that's the only way that you can keep it. What do you do with the original? Keep it, put it on eBay, sell it. God. What would you do with the, what would our thinking in the Western world would be what? I'm keeping it. But what would they do with it?
Pass it on.
They send the original. Because the original, when it shows up, is carrying the full authority. It's your responsibility to copy it correctly. Second man copies it, scribes it out. He does what with it? Sends it on. The next church does what? Exchange, wash, and repeat. Exchange. So from that humble beginning is where we now have over 6,000 or close to 6,000 Greek manuscripts. The printing press was about 1,500, 1,600, somewhere in there. And so when the printing press was developed, the need for hand copying was no longer necessary. We can now copy with fidelity. He spoke about this place in Egypt called Oxyrhynchus. It's a city, and what they did was they discovered, because they would use the scrolls, papyri, that kind of thing, the same way. And they discovered some of these scrolls, and they can date them back and go, oh my gosh, these things stayed in circulation for 200 or 300 years. Now, what does that tell you about what the people were thinking about? Those were not sacred scrolls to Christianity, but that told you that the people that had them thought they were very, very important, and they took good care of them. Do you think they were taking good care of the originals? Yeah. Yeah. So we have every reason to believe that the earliest manuscripts that we have of the New Testament, which are only about 50 years after the original autographs were written, that those were both in circulation at the same time, overlapping each other, to where the ultimate quality check is this right? Go back and look at the original, we got it. And so he's kind of taking on Ehrman as well. He never mentions his name, but all of those people who say, you just can't trust this stuff. No, that's not going to work. So here's some important things that we need to know. 45, good. These are some important things we need to know. The siege of Jerusalem, according to Josephus, that was about 1 million people that died over a 3-year period. It got so bad that Josephus indicates people were eating their babies. They were starved absolutely to the point of desperation. The destruction of the temple took place after the siege of Jerusalem. The Romans sacked the city, scaled the walls, got to the temple, had some thinking that there was some gold and stuff in there, and they went to looking for it, and they tore it completely apart. So the temple was destroyed. A couple of guys whose names are sort of important. Peter died, Paul died, James, the half-brother of Jesus, died, James the Apostle, and Stephen died. All of those occurred from the mid-60s to the 70 AD. Which one of those are recorded in Scripture? Paul. Number 6. Stephen's death is recorded in Acts, and it's also mentioned that James was beheaded, not the brother James, the apostle James. So we've got Acts telling us about that, but Acts doesn't tell us anything about 1 million people dying, a temple being destroyed, 2 of the pillars of the church being martyred. What does that give you? A pretty good arguing point to start with regarding Acts, written before or after those? It sure seems that way. It's a reasonable argument to make. We can also point out that Paul in 1 Timothy quotes Luke and says it's Scripture, which means it's been canonized, or if you want to just say it's been formally recognized as being, this is as important as the Old Testament. So he says in 1 Timothy, don't muzzle the ox while he's threshing. That makes pretty good sense if you think about it. And that came from Deuteronomy. And then he says, you got to pay the laborer what he's worth. I have to take a sidebar here. When we were in Auburn, Alabama, the church was known for having deacons with big bellies and little ties. When we were in Auburn, Alabama, one of the deacons proudly came into a staff meeting and said, he was speaking of illegal immigrants that he had hired, I hire them for as cheap as I can, work them for as hard as I can, for as long as I can. Have you read 1 Timothy? That's wrong. From a Christian perspective, abusing your worker is wrong, period. And if you can get by with it, you'll get your pound of flesh now, but there's something to be said for it's just not the way it's supposed to be. So we don't see any of those in Acts. In Acts is where we see the history of the church really beginning to unfold. We wouldn't expect Paul to write about his own death. That would be strange. We know that Paul finished writing in about the mid-60s because he was martyred in Rome, beheaded around 65, 66, 64, 67, somewhere in there. Same thing with Peter. During when Nero went crazy, and when I say went crazy, he literally probably went crazy. He was eating from lead pots and lead plates, lead poisoning, buck crazy. He'd take Christians, tie a rope around them, soak them in oil, use them for street lights. This man was insane. He had Peter martyred or killed, and the same thing is true with Paul. So those are very, very accurate extra biblical sources, but you won't find them in the Bible. So that's the question you can ask. If all of those things are there, and I'm not going to hang my hat on this, it's possible that the later dates for the scriptures are correct. I don't think they are, and I don't think it changes anything, but I think the stronger argument is for the earlier dates, because if none of those things had taken place, and that was AD 70, that was a marker in Jewish history, Christian history too, but particularly Jewish, because it was the destruction of the temple, and 1 million other people died in Jerusalem. And this is where Jesus said, if you see them coming over the ridge, run. If you're pregnant, run. Woe to these people that hang around. He's basically saying you don't want to be here when the temple goes down. And it took 3 years for that to finally take place. But Acts is predated by Luke. How do we know that? Because what is the first words of Acts? in my previous letter. So I explained to you, so he's telling him, I already wrote you one letter, Theophilus. Here's my next one. And so if we have that, what does it give us? Because generally speaking, everybody thinks Mark is the earliest gospel. Why? It's written in the simplest language. It's like Dragnet. Just give me the facts, ma'am. Just the facts. And it just spits the facts out at you with very little narrative. The language in it tends to be a little bit more primitive. People won't die on that hill, but they'll argue it that Mark is probably the first one. So why do some people put Mark at 70? And that's the answer. They know the temple was destroyed in 70. And what did Jesus say in Mark? The temple would be what? Destroyed. And so the non-believing scholar says, there's no way Jesus could have known that. Why did Mark put it in there? Because it had already happened. Therefore, Mark didn't write until 70. That is the strongest argument given. Now, what that ignores is, what do we do with this little thing called the resurrection? Because if he did rise from the grave, I think the ability to be able to say, this generation will not pass away before that temple's gone down, I think he could roll that one out there. But the primary reason for dating Mark later is this inconvenient embarrassment of the temple prophecy. And they're saying, well, Jesus couldn't prophesy, so Mark just had to sneak it in there and kind of make him a hero. Whoa. This is another guy that you should know his name, William Lane Craig. He is more of a philosopher. The other guys are hanging out in the biblical academic side, but this guy is he does a really good job of arguing for the faith, and he says this: the arguments for the traditional dating of the Gospels are kind of compared to like a line of drunks reeling arm in arm down the street. Trip up one and they all collapse. So I think you can just see them walking down Bourbon Street right now, right? With their biblical manuscripts in hand. And yeah, here we go. Since it is generally agreed that Mark was one of the sources used by Matthew and Luke. The reason for that is Matthew and Luke quote Mark a lot. You can find his language in there. It follows that if Mark was written around AD 7, then the other Gospels have to be later than that. So the usual dating of the Gospels depends crucially on Mark's date. Well, but if we begin with Luke and Matthew and work backwards, then the date of Mark is pushed back well before 70. The evidence that Acts was written prior to AD 70. Paul's still alive. If you read the end of the book, where's Paul at? He's in Rome. I'm writing to you from Rome. He ain't dead.
I'm cold, bring me my coat.
That's right. So in Acts, Acts concludes with Paul being greeted in Rome, if you will. So no mention of his death. Paul's still alive under house arrest in Rome. No mention of his significant events during the 60s, such as the martyrdom of James. That would be the brother thrown off of the temple. And for him to be thrown off of the temple still had to be what? There. So that means James was martyred before 70, right? The persecution of Nero, that was the streetlights. The siege of Jerusalem. The disproportionate emphasis on Paul's recent voyage to Rome. Acts spends a lot of time on that. Seems to Craig and to me to be persuasive, since Acts is a sequel to Luke, because Luke tells us in my previous letter, he's talking about this letter that he wrote Luke. Luke would have been written in the 50s, and accordingly Mark even earlier. Such a dating makes very good sense. It's incredible that the early church would have waited for decades before committing the Jesus story on which it was founded to write. And I would agree with that. I think a lot of them, when it first happened, they were like, we don't need to write anything down, because what were they asking Jesus all the time? When are you coming back? This has got to be ending real soon. In their mind, what? We don't need to write anything down. And then a few years go by, and you're kind of like, we need to get this. But it's not a long time. And so, certainly not decades. So if you start from Acts and work backwards, this is what you get. You get Acts 70s, early 60s, mid 60s. That's going to put Luke 50s, early 60s. And then that's going to put Mark even earlier than that, perhaps in the 40s. And so this is another big hint. What did we just talk about? The siege of Jerusalem. Jerusalem got sacked by the Romans. Why? The Romans got tired of fooling with these people. Some dude got mad, went to the temple, killed a couple of Romans, and made a mess of things, and got back to Nero, and he's like, I'm done. So he sends the army for a 3-year siege. But this is what you find in Acts 14. Paul was called in, Tertullus. All I can see is a turtle. And I know that's not what he is, but that's all I can see. Presented his case before Felix. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. Does that sound like a resurrection or an insurrection is about to take place? No, we're still on the goods. We're still on the goods with Rome. Man, hey, you've brought a lot of reform. You guys aren't too bad. I mean, now that's probably some political brown nosing, but you couldn't say that unless you could get by with it. So he is basically, at this point, Paul is saying, this is not, you guys have helped us. Well, that's not run because we just saw the people showing up. When you see the people carrying those eagles, run. That's not what this is. So it's clearly a different picture. So this is Dawkins. This is what he said. Much of the Bible is not systematically evil, but it's just plain weird. And that's what you would expect of a chaotically cobbled together anthology of disjointed documents. Are they disjointed? Hardly. Composed, revised, 99.6% accuracy over 1,500 years of hand copying. That's the New Testament. That's revised. Translated? Well, yeah, they were translated from what? Greek too, but what was the native language? Greek. How many of them we got? Almost 6,000. How much do they vary? They don't. Translated? Distorted? 99.6% accuracy? And improved? Dawkins is way over his skis. He don't know what he don't know. It's that bad. And he made a bunch of money selling this book, and a bunch of people buy this dribble. And that is absolute, that's an embarrassment. This is flat earth kind of talk. I mean, it ranks right there. When you start this kind of stuff and you start saying that, you're just ignoring absolutely anything. Improved by hundreds of anonymous authors. Yes, they're called scribes. But they're not, they were not intended to be the focus. The words were the focus. Editors and copies, unknown to us and mostly unknown to each other, spanning 9 centuries. That is just a fundamentally disturbing statement. But it is one, go back to what Josh McDowell said at the beginning. He's talked to over 4,000 people, and most people can't tell anything about what we just talked about regarding the history, particularly of the New Testament. So if somebody asks you how many manuscripts are there in Greek, you can say what? About 6,000. One of the earliest ones, they go back to about 50 years after the autographs. How long were the autographs in circulation? We have good reason to believe at least 100 years, maybe 200, maybe 300, but certainly 50. Why aren't any of these things in the New Testament? But the books were just written years and years and years and years and years. How do you know that? Why doesn't Acts tell us about the sacking of Jerusalem? Here's a good question. Why don't any of the writings tell us about Jerusalem? It could be argued that every book in there, and most people will put John post, they'll put him about 90 AD, somewhere around in there. And I think the reason for that is that the book is apocalyptic, first of all, so when you start, it wouldn't be necessary to talk about the temple being destroyed, because he's talking about persecution. This would have certainly been a time of persecution after the destruction of the temple and the dispersion of the Christians. But all that said, Paul wrote everything he wrote before 70. Peter wrote everything he wrote before 70. That's 2/3 of the things beyond the gospel, maybe more right there. Then you've got John writing some of his. 1 John is earlier, those kinds of things. The Gospels themselves, it's a pretty good chance Mark was writing in the 40s. That's 15 years after the crucifixion. So, and then the degree of detail that was taken in trying to make sure these things were right. So this might be, if somebody says this might be a good response. Just turn around, walk off, go get a shave. I don't know what to tell you. Because it is that weak of an argument. So when you pick the Bible up, particularly the New Testament, we're not even, we leave the Old Testament aside right now. When you pick up the New Testament, when you pick it up, you got to realize that is over 2,000 years of copying, 1,500 of them by hand, 99.6% accurate. Bruce Metzger says, I wrote a book that says this whole thing can't be trusted. And then in the back of my book, I said, but there's no difference between what I believe and the guy who's the eminent Christian scholar in this field. And it's like, my head just blew. How do you admit this, right? So the skeptics that attack the biblical reliability, they're doing it in a platform that doesn't have the facts with it. So there we are. Next week, we will do divinity of Christ. Did they really think he was divine? So now what we have discovered is this. When we read it, can we believe it? Yes. So now the question is, what did they think? Why did they think it? And what did it cause? Now, obviously, did the Jews think he was divine? No. Was Jesus trying to indicate that he was divine? Yes. And so we'll take a look at how this was not interpreted. And what did it take to prove it? The resurrection. That's the week after that. But here we are with biblical reliability. So, thoughts or questions?
Yes.
Yes.
Why are the autographs not written in Aramaic?
So it's possible that I would say that the common language, the language that, for example, Jesus spoke Aramaic. I'm trying to remember the Aramaic expression that they have for it when he was on the cross. It'll come to me. Anyway, but the writings tended to be in Greek. Greek was the universal language of communication, whereas Arabic would have been a little bit street.
I was just thinking because Paul was so versed before in the Torah and Jewish and Aramaic and the things you talk about making new scrolls, copying the old scrolls, that it seemed like naturally they would wrote in Aramaic instead of Greek. It seemed like Greek would have been a jump.
I think Greek's more universal. Hey, you got something?
I was just going to say the reason that Greek was the universal language was thanks to
Alexander the Great, right?
Yes.
Spread it. It didn't matter where you were from. If you were doing anything academic, you did it in Greek because that was sort of the crossover language for everyone to become.
Kind of got English has become that.
It would be, you were probably a strange person if you didn't speak two languages in that day. By strange, I mean you would be the rare exception.
And to keep everything equal for everybody, all your business was done in Greek.
Exactly.
All your everything was done that you wanted anybody outside of your village to know anything about was done in Greek because it was accepted across everything that was the known world. Thanks to
In our world, Aramaic would have almost been Cajun French.
yeah.
All right.
It would have been localized, but not something that would have necessarily
Spread.
that would have been able to broadcast into a world. And remember, these letters were going, particularly Paul's.
To
They were going
the Gentiles.
different cultures, yeah, altogether sometimes.
Who was Mark?
Yes,
Who was Mark? He's not one of the original 12.
Mark was the scholarly consensus is Mark was John Mark. John Mark was a follower of Peter. More than likely, what John Mark did was followed Peter around and listened carefully to the stories that Peter was telling. So he became, if you will, an on-the-scene investigative reporter, as did Luke. Luke's account, because he was not an eyewitness to Jesus as an apostle at first either. Luke's account carries much more detail about Christmas. The details. It's very likely Luke interviewed Mary and got the information from her about some of the details of the birth that the other stories don't include. But Luke makes it clear. When he writes, he says, I've investigated these matters thoroughly. I'm sending this to you as a historical account. There's one other thing you need to know about ancient history. It was not necessary to put things in order and for them to be considered to be correct. So when, for example, some of them may say, Jesus told this story and then Jesus told that story, they could have been separated, but in their world, these 2 points fit together, and so it was, nobody would say that's wrong. They would have all bought that. Plus, over 3 years, do you think Jesus gave the same sermons? Well, of course he did. Time and time and time and time again to different audiences. So the combination of hearing and rehearing, so you'll find in one, like Mark might emphasize a little bit something of what Jesus says compared to Luke. And that's because for Mark, that makes it works better for his audience. For Luke, so there's another guy. His name's Darrell Bach. He teaches at Dallas. Used to, I guess he still does. Dallas Theological Seminary, and he wrote a chapter in a book that's called Live, Jive, or Memorex, and he's talking about the scriptures. And what he's saying is, these guys didn't try and record them word for word. That wasn't what they were trying to do. What they were trying to do was get it to their audience in a way that was entirely faithful to the original message, but they used the literary license that was available to them, and no one that passed every spell test. So no, they don't sound exactly the same. So this whole business about, well, they weren't copied word for word. Well, no, they weren't. And that's one more testimony to the legitimacy of these things, really. So if you are a believer and your faith is threatened, typically it's threatened in two different ways. Either you're not even sure there's a God, and I think we sort of left that door wide open to that possibility last week. And then if you say, well, if there is a God, do you think he would have made sure that the story that he wanted told got told the way it was supposed to be told? Sure does seem that way. So it kind of, it can start to really make a nice little anchor for a place to hunker down when times get tough and go, well, I can remember all this stuff and I know it's true, so I can go from there. Let's go ahead and close her down. Let's a quick prayer. Father, we thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for the immense amount of evidence you've given us to show that the Bible is indeed reliable. The New Testament was not written by a bunch of people who made up myths and stories to try and convince a bunch of people that the things they were telling them were all fabricated. We'll see when we get to the resurrection. That's just simply not possible either. But clearly the data that we have and the information we have points us right square to the autographs themselves. We can be confident that when we read the words in our Bible, they are almost identical to the original words as they were originally written. That should give us all great, great comfort. In your Son's name we pray.